Most people spend years trying to control circumstances. They try to control outcomes. They try to control other people. They try to control what happens around them. Yet much of life remains unpredictable. Circumstances shift regardless of how carefully they are managed. Other people make their own decisions, guided by their own reasoning, largely unmoved by anyone else's attempt to influence them. Outcomes depend on countless factors that no single person can fully account for, let alone control. The one thing that remains consistently available for improvement is often the one thing people understand the least: themselves. This is a strange gap when examined closely. A person can spend enormous energy trying to shape their environment, their relationships, their reputation, their results, while investing comparatively little effort in understanding the one system they actually have direct access to at every moment. Their own mind, thoughts, emotions, impulses, and decisions all originate there, and yet most people move through years of their lives without ever examining these internal processes with the same seriousness they apply to external goals. What would change in your life if you developed the ability to consistently govern your thoughts, emotions, impulses, and actions, not perfectly and not without effort, but consistently, in a way that no longer left behavior largely at the mercy of whatever internal state happened to be strongest in a given moment? Many struggles are not created by external obstacles. They are created by internal conflict, a mind that wants one thing but chooses another, a goal that competes with comfort, a decision that is influenced by emotion instead of judgment. This internal conflict is often mistaken for an external problem, a lack of opportunity, a difficult circumstance, an unhelpful environment, when the actual source of the struggle is closer to home, a persistent gap between what is genuinely wanted and what is actually chosen, moment to moment. Some individuals spend their lives reacting to themselves, carried along by whichever impulse, emotion, or habit happens to be present, rarely questioning why a particular choice was made, or whether it aligned with anything they would consciously endorse, if given time to consider it. Others learn how to understand themselves, developing a clearer picture of their own patterns, tendencies, and triggers, and eventually how to lead themselves, using that understanding to make decisions that reflect genuine intention rather than automatic reaction. This distinction between being led by internal forces and learning to lead them sits at the center of everything that follows. It does not require becoming a different person, free from emotion, impulse, or difficulty. It requires developing a different relationship with the internal experiences that every person already has, one built on understanding rather than avoidance, and on deliberate direction rather than passive reaction. By understanding the foundations of self-mastery, it becomes possible to create greater discipline, clarity, emotional stability, and personal freedom, not through force applied against oneself, but through a clearer, more accurate understanding of how the mind actually works, and how that understanding can be used to guide behavior more deliberately over time. What follows is an exploration of that process, examined closely enough to be genuinely useful, rather than merely inspiring. It concerns the mechanics of thought, emotion, habit, and decision-making, and how these mechanics can be worked with deliberately, rather than left to operate entirely on their own. There is a common assumption worth setting aside before going further: the idea that self-mastery means achieving a permanent state of calm, control, or discipline, a fixed condition reached once and then maintained effortlessly afterward. This assumption tends to discourage genuine progress because it sets an unreasonable standard, one that treats any lapse, any moment of impulsive behavior or emotional reactivity, as evidence that the entire effort has failed. A more accurate understanding treats self-mastery not as a destination, but as an ongoing relationship with one's own mind, one that improves gradually through sustained attention and practice, without ever becoming entirely free of difficulty. The internal forces being discussed here, impulse, emotion, distraction, fear, do not disappear once a person becomes more disciplined. They continue to arise, sometimes strongly, throughout a person's entire life. What changes is not their presence, but the degree of influence they are given over actual behavior. This reframing matters because it changes what progress actually looks like in practice. Progress is not the absence of temptation, doubt, or emotional intensity. It is an increasing capacity to notice these internal states clearly, to understand what they are signaling, and to choose a response deliberately, rather than being carried along automatically by whichever state happens to be present. This capacity develops slowly, through repeated practice across countless ordinary moments, most of which will never be witnessed by anyone else. Self-mastery is often misunderstood because it is confused with self-control alone, a narrower concept that captures only part of what actually produces meaningful, lasting change in behavior. Self-control refers to the ability to resist a particular impulse in a particular moment, declining a temptation, pushing through discomfort, holding back a reactive word during a tense conversation. This capacity matters, but on its own, it tends to be fragile, dependent on willpower that fluctuates considerably from day to day and tends to weaken under fatigue, stress, or repeated demand. Self-awareness operates differently, and it is often the missing piece in an approach to self-mastery built entirely around control. Self-awareness refers to a clear, ongoing understanding of one's own patterns, what triggers a particular impulse, what emotional state tends to precede a particular kind of decision, what internal narrative accompanies moments of resistance or avoidance. Without this awareness, self-control operates blindly, forced to resist impulses as they arise without any deeper understanding of where they come from or why they recur so predictably. The difference between these two capacities becomes clear in how they age over time. A person relying primarily on self-control tends to experience the same struggles repeatedly, resisting the same temptations, fighting the same impulses year after year, because the underlying pattern producing those impulses has never been examined closely enough to be addressed at its source. A person who has developed genuine self-awareness alongside self-control tends to experience these struggles differently over time, not because the impulses disappear, but because they are recognized earlier, understood more clearly, and addressed with strategies informed by that understanding, rather than through repeated, effortful resistance applied identically each time. This points toward a specific practice worth naming directly, understanding your own patterns of thought and behavior closely enough that they stop operating invisibly. Most people carry a general, vague sense of their own tendencies, an awareness that they tend to procrastinate or tend to become defensive during criticism, without examining these tendencies with any real precision. This vagueness limits how effectively these patterns can actually be addressed, since a vague awareness of a general tendency offers little practical guidance for what to actually do differently in a specific moment. A more precise examination involves noticing the specific triggers, sequences, and internal narratives that accompany a recurring pattern. Procrastination, for instance, rarely arises from laziness in any simple sense. It usually follows a specific internal sequence, a task perceived as unpleasant or overwhelming, an emotional discomfort in response to that perception, and an impulse to escape that discomfort through some other, more immediately gratifying activity. Understanding this specific sequence, rather than simply labeling the pattern as procrastination, makes it considerably easier to intervene at an earlier point, addressing the discomfort directly rather than only noticing the pattern once avoidance has already taken hold. This kind of precise self-examination requires a particular quality of attention, one that observes one's own thoughts and behavior without immediately judging or explaining them away. Judgment tends to interfere with accurate observation, since a pattern examined primarily through the lens of self-criticism is rarely examined clearly. The discomfort of the self-criticism itself becoming another thing to avoid. Observation without immediate judgment allows a pattern to be seen more accurately, simply as information about how the mind currently tends to operate, rather than as evidence of some deeper personal failing. Personal responsibility plays a foundational role in how this examination actually translates into change, and it deserves direct attention because it is often one of the more uncomfortable aspects of self-mastery to accept fully. Responsibility, in this context, does not mean assuming blame for every circumstance a person encounters, since many circumstances genuinely lie outside anyone's control. It means consistently directing attention and effort toward what can actually be influenced, one's own thoughts, decisions, and responses, rather than toward external factors that cannot be changed through personal effort alone. This distinction matters because attention spent on uncontrollable factors, unfair circumstances, other people's behavior, past events that cannot be undone, tends to produce very little in return, regardless of how much energy is invested in it. Attention spent on what remains genuinely within a person's control, how a difficult moment is approached, how a mistake is processed, how a temptation is met, tends to produce something over time, even when that something develops slowly and without immediate, visible confirmation. This same principle explains why habits carry so much weight in shaping identity over time. A habit, repeated consistently, does more than produce a specific outcome. It gradually shapes how a person understands themselves. Someone who consistently follows through on difficult commitments begins to think of themselves as someone who follows through, not as an aspiration, but as an accurate description based on accumulated evidence. Someone who consistently avoids difficult commitments begins to internalize a different, more limiting self-understanding, one that then makes future avoidance feel more natural and future follow through feel more effortful than it would otherwise need to be. This relationship between habit and identity works in both directions, which is part of why it matters so much. Identity shapes which habits feel natural to maintain, and habits, sustained long enough, shape identity in return. A person who wants to become more disciplined benefits from understanding this cycle directly, recognizing that consistent, even small, disciplined actions gradually build a self-concept that makes further discipline easier to sustain, while inconsistency builds the opposite, a self-concept that treats inconsistency as normal and expected, making genuine change considerably harder to initiate and sustain. This is why early consistency matters disproportionately, even when the specific actions involved are modest. The primary value of an early disciplined habit is not always found in its immediate, direct result, which may be small, but in the identity it begins to establish, an identity that eventually makes larger, more demanding disciplined actions considerably more natural to sustain than they would have been without this foundation already in place. Most people never notice this struggle clearly enough to name it, the internal conflict between emotional intensity and considered judgment, but it sits near the center of nearly every difficulty examined throughout this exploration. Emotional control does not mean suppressing emotion or pretending that certain feelings do not exist. It means allowing an emotion to be felt fully, without granting it automatic authority over behavior. This distinction matters because suppression tends to produce more difficulty than it resolves, the suppressed emotion typically resurfacing later, often in a less manageable form than it would have taken if it had simply been allowed to exist and pass through in the moment it arose. Emotional maturity develops through repeated practice of this distinction. Feeling an emotion honestly, while maintaining enough separation from it that behavior can still be chosen deliberately. This maturity is not the same as emotional flatness or indifference. A person with developed emotional maturity still feels anger, fear, disappointment, and excitement, sometimes intensely. What differs is the relationship between that feeling and what happens next, a relationship built on observation and choice, rather than automatic translation of feeling into behavior. This is where self-mastery begins, in the narrow but significant gap between an emotion arising and a response following it. This gap can be widened through deliberate practice, primarily by developing the habit of noticing an emotion as it begins to rise, rather than only noticing it once it has already shaped behavior. This noticing does not require lengthy analysis in the moment. It can be as simple as briefly naming what is being felt, silently, without judgment, which activates a different part of the mind than the one generating the emotional intensity, often enough to slow the automatic sequence from feeling directly into action. Closely related to this is the ability to delay gratification, one of the more thoroughly examined aspects of self-mastery, and one that connects directly to nearly everything else discussed throughout this exploration. Delaying gratification means choosing a longer-term benefit over an immediately available, smaller reward, a choice that requires tolerating the discomfort of postponed satisfaction in service of an outcome that has not yet arrived and cannot be guaranteed with complete certainty. This capacity is difficult precisely because immediate rewards carry a kind of psychological weight that distant rewards do not, a vividness and certainty that makes them considerably more compelling in the moment of choice, even when a clear, rational comparison would favor the delayed option. Managing this difficulty does not require eliminating the pool of immediate reward, which would require ignoring a very real feature of how motivation works. It requires building enough structure and awareness around moments of choice that the pull of immediate reward can be recognized and weighed consciously, rather than being allowed to determine the decision by default. Managing impulses and temptations depends on many of the same mechanisms already discussed, but it deserves direct attention because impulses tend to operate with a particular kind of urgency that makes them harder to examine calmly in the moment they arise. An impulse typically presents itself as immediate and pressing, as though it must be acted upon right now, even when a closer examination would reveal that very little would actually change. if the response were delayed by even a short period. This sense of urgency is often the impulse's most persuasive feature, and it is usually inaccurate. Very few impulses genuinely require an immediate response. Most simply feel urgent because urgency is part of how impulses are generated, a mechanism that evolved to prioritize quick action over careful deliberation in situations where quick action was once genuinely necessary. In the modern environment, this same mechanism activates constantly, in response to temptations and distractions that carry none of the genuine urgency the mechanism originally evolved to address. Recognizing this manufactured urgency is often enough to create a small but meaningful pause before acting on an impulse, a pause during which the actual importance of the impulse can be assessed more accurately than the impulse's own sense of urgency would suggest. This pause does not need to be long. Even a few seconds of deliberate delay tends to reduce the intensity of an impulse considerably, allowing a more considered response to become available, where an automatic one would otherwise have taken over. Recognizing internal resistance adds another layer to this practice, since resistance often shows up not as an obvious temptation, but as a subtler reluctance, a vague sense of not wanting to begin a difficult task, a quiet pull towards some other, easier activity, an unexamined hesitation that delays action without ever fully announcing itself as avoidance. This resistance is easy to rationalize in the moment it occurs, explained away as simply not being the right time, or as a reasonable need for more preparation, when the actual underlying cause is closer to a straightforward reluctance to face discomfort. Learning to recognize this resistance for what it is, rather than accepting its various rationalizations at face value, is one of the more practically useful skills within self-mastery. This recognition does not eliminate the resistance itself, which tends to arise reliably before any sufficiently difficult or unfamiliar task. It simply prevents the resistance from operating unexamined, disguised as a reasonable justification for delay rather than recognized honestly as what it actually is. This entire practice, delaying gratification, managing impulses, recognizing resistance, ultimately serves a purpose that is easy to overlook: why discipline creates freedom rather than restricting it. Discipline is often associated with limitation, a narrowing of available choices in service of some longer-term goal. This association captures only the surface of what discipline actually produces over time. A person without developed discipline is, in a meaningful sense, governed by whatever impulse, distraction, or emotional state happens to be strongest in a given moment, a form of constraint that is rarely recognized as such because it does not feel like restriction from the inside. It feels like simply doing what one wants. But this apparent freedom tends to produce a narrower set of actual life outcomes over time, since impulsive, moment-to-moment decisions rarely accumulate into anything substantial or aligned with a person's deeper values and goals. A person with developed discipline experiences a different kind of freedom, one built through the accumulated capability, trust, and stability that disciplined behavior tends to produce over time. This freedom is less immediately apparent, since it does not feel like doing whatever is most appealing in any given moment, but it tends to be considerably more durable, expressed as an expanded range of genuine options, rather than as an unconstrained indulgence of whichever impulse happens to be present. There is another layer to this process worth examining directly: the relationship between attention and self-mastery, a relationship that tends to be underestimated in most discussions of discipline and self-control. Attention is the resource through which nearly every other aspect of self-mastery actually operates. Noticing an emotion as it rises, recognizing an impulse before acting on it, examining a pattern of thought or behavior honestly, all of these depend on attention, being available to notice what is actually happening internally, rather than being fully absorbed by external demands or distractions. This means that protecting attention is not a separate concern from self-mastery, but one of its more foundational requirements. A person whose attention is constantly fragmented, pulled in many directions by notifications, minor distractions, and unrelated demands, has considerably less capacity available for the kind of internal observation that self-mastery actually depends on. The internal signals that would otherwise provide useful information, an emotion beginning to rise, a pattern of resistance beginning to form, tend to go unnoticed amid the general noise of divided attention, simply because there is not enough uncommitted attention remaining to register them. Protecting focus in a distracted environment requires deliberate effort, since the environment itself is generally not structured to support sustained attention. Constant access to information, entertainment, and communication creates constant opportunities for attention to be redirected away from whatever is currently being deliberately pursued, whether that pursuit is a specific task or the quieter, ongoing work of internal observation. This protection does not require eliminating every source of distraction entirely, which is rarely realistic for most people in most circumstances. It requires developing a clear enough sense of genuine priorities that attention can be deliberately redirected back to them repeatedly, whenever it has drifted, rather than allowing that drift to continue simply because redirecting attention requires a small, repeated effort. This repeated redirection, while individually minor, tends to compound significantly over time, producing a considerably different quality of engagement with meaningful work and internal reflection than a pattern of allowing attention to be captured passively by whatever happens to demand it most persistently. This same capacity for attention underlies the difference between responding and reacting, a distinction that has already been touched on, but deserves more direct examination here. Reacting happens quickly, driven almost entirely by whatever emotional or impulsive state is currently strongest, with very little space between a triggering event and the behavior that follows. Responding happens more deliberately, still informed by emotion, since emotion carries genuine information, but shaped by a broader, more considered evaluation of the situation rather than by the immediate intensity of a single internal state. The difference between these two is not always visible from the outside in any single moment. The internal process producing each one, however, is considerably different, and over time, that internal difference produces very different patterns of behavior. A person who consistently reacts tends to accumulate a series of decisions that, viewed collectively, feel disconnected from any consistent set of values or goals, since each decision was shaped primarily by whatever internal state happened to be present at the time it was made. A person who consistently responds tends to accumulate a more coherent pattern of decisions, one that reflects a stable underlying set of priorities rather than a series of disconnected reactions to momentary internal states. And this is where greater control becomes possible, once consistency is understood not as an occasional accomplishment, but as a specific, ongoing pattern of behavior developed deliberately over time. Consistency is often admired from the outside, as though it were a fixed trait, something certain people simply have and others do not. In practice, it is built gradually, through the accumulation of many individual decisions to follow through, even when following through requires overcoming resistance or discomfort in a given moment. Developing consistency does not require dramatic effort applied occasionally. It tends to be built more reliably through modest, sustainable effort applied repeatedly, since a pattern that depends on intense, difficult effort each time tends to be abandoned more quickly than a pattern built around a level of effort that can genuinely be sustained across an extended period. This is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of building consistency, that a smaller, more sustainable commitment, maintained reliably, tends to produce better long-term results than a larger, more ambitious commitment that proves too demanding to sustain past the first few difficult weeks. This consistency connects directly to a specific and often overlooked practice: the importance of keeping promises to yourself. Most people take external commitments seriously, showing up for appointments, meeting deadlines set by others, honoring agreements made with people whose opinion of them matters. Internal commitments, promises made privately to oneself, tend to receive considerably less weight, broken quietly, and without much apparent consequence, since no external party is present to notice or hold the commitment accountable. This asymmetry matters more than it initially appears to, because a pattern of broken internal promises produces a specific and corrosive effect over time, a gradual erosion of self-trust. Each broken promise to oneself, however minor, becomes a small piece of evidence, filed away largely unconsciously, that one's own word cannot be fully relied upon. Accumulated over enough instances, this evidence produces a genuine, if often unexamined, doubt about one's own reliability, a doubt that then makes future commitments, even reasonable ones, feel less credible from the moment they are made. Building confidence through self-trust works in the opposite direction. Through the accumulated evidence of promises kept, even small ones, even when keeping them required overcoming genuine resistance. This kind of confidence differs meaningfully from confidence built primarily on external achievement or validation, since it does not depend on favorable outcomes or the approval of others. It depends instead on a private, internal record of demonstrated reliability, a record that remains stable regardless of how any particular external circumstance happens to unfold. This self-trust, once established, tends to change how difficult moments are approached going forward. A person with a strong internal record of kept promises tends to enter a difficult new commitment with a reasonable expectation that it, too, will be honored, based on genuine accumulated evidence rather than on hope alone. A person without this record tends to enter the same commitment with an underlying uncertainty about their own follow-through, an uncertainty that can itself become part of what makes the commitment harder to sustain, since doubt about one's own reliability tends to weaken the very follow-through that doubt is worried about. Managing fear, doubt, and uncertainty represents one of the more demanding aspects of self-mastery, since these experiences tend to arise precisely during the moments when clear thinking and decisive action matter most. Fear signals a perceived threat. Doubt signals uncertainty about one's own judgment or capability, and general uncertainty reflects the simple, unavoidable reality that most meaningful decisions must be made without complete information about how they will ultimately unfold. None of these experiences can be eliminated entirely, and attempting to eliminate them tends to produce more difficulty than accepting their presence as a normal, expected feature of any meaningful pursuit. What can be developed instead is a different relationship with these experiences, one where fear, doubt, and uncertainty are acknowledged honestly, without being allowed to make decisions by default, simply because they happen to be present and vocal in a given moment. This requires distinguishing between fear that carries genuine, useful information, a real risk worth taking seriously, and fear that is simply a byproduct of unfamiliarity or discomfort, present regardless of whether the situation actually carries meaningful risk. This distinction is not always obvious in the moment, but it can be examined deliberately, asking what specific risk the fear is actually pointing toward, and whether that risk is proportionate to the intensity of the fear being experienced. Fear disproportionate to actual risk tends to indicate discomfort with unfamiliarity rather than genuine danger, and recognizing this distinction allows the fear to be acknowledged without being obeyed automatically. This same discipline extends to how decisions are made more broadly, particularly the distinction between decisions based on values and decisions based on mood. A mood is a temporary internal state, shaped by factors that often have little to do with the actual importance of a given decision: sleep, recent events, minor frustrations accumulated over the course of a day. A value is a considered standard, established during a calmer, clearer moment, meant to guide behavior consistently regardless of whatever mood happens to be present when a particular decision arises. Decisions made primarily according to mood tend to be inconsistent, producing a pattern of behavior that shifts unpredictably depending on internal states that have little bearing on what actually matters. Decisions made according to established values tend to be considerably more stable, since the standard being applied does not depend on the emotional weather present at the moment the decision is made. This does not mean ignoring genuine, informative feelings entirely, but it means building enough structure around significant decisions that they are not left vulnerable to whichever mood happens to be dominant. When the moment to decide arrives, the role of patience in personal development connects closely to all of this. Since nearly every capacity discussed so far, emotional regulation, consistency, self-trust, value-based decision-making, develops gradually rather than immediately. Patience, in this context, is not passive waiting. It is an accurate expectation about how long genuine internal change actually takes, paired with a willingness to continue the relevant practice even during periods when progress feels slow or difficult to perceive directly. Without this patience, the natural slowness of genuine internal change is easily mistaken for evidence that the effort is not working, leading to premature abandonment of practices that would likely have produced meaningful results if sustained a while longer. With patience, this same slowness is recognized as a normal feature of the process, one that does not require an immediate, visible confirmation in order to justify continued effort. Accepting discomfort as part of growth follows naturally from this understanding of patience, though it deserves separate attention because the instinct to avoid discomfort is often strong enough to override even a clear intellectual understanding that discomfort is a normal part of meaningful change. Most valuable internal development, greater emotional control, greater consistency, greater capacity to delay gratification, requires moving through periods of genuine discomfort rather than around them, since the old, more automatic patterns being replaced tend to feel more comfortable specifically. because they are familiar, not because they actually serve a person's genuine interests. A person who has not developed a tolerance for this kind of discomfort tends to interpret its presence as a signal that something has gone wrong, retreating back toward familiar, automatic patterns the moment discomfort arises. A person who has developed this tolerance interprets the same discomfort differently, recognizing it as an expected companion of genuine change, rather than as evidence that the change itself is misguided. This reinterpretation does not make the discomfort disappear, but it changes what is done in response to it, allowing the discomfort to be tolerated long enough for a new, more deliberate pattern to actually take hold. Developing resilience during setbacks depends on a related but distinct capacity, the ability to recover from a specific failure or disappointment without allowing that failure to undermine the entire underlying effort. Setbacks are a near certain feature of any sustained process of internal change, moments where an old pattern reasserts itself despite considerable progress, where a difficult emotion overwhelms a carefully developed response, where a promise to oneself is broken despite genuine intention to keep it. The difference between people who sustain long-term internal growth and people who abandon it after a setback is rarely a difference in whether setbacks occur, since they occur for nearly everyone attempting genuine change. It is a difference in how the setback is interpreted and responded to afterward. A setback interpreted as final evidence of failure tends to end the effort entirely, since continuing feels pointless once the setback has been assigned this kind of definitive meaning. A setback interpreted as a single, isolated instance within a much longer process tends to be recoverable, examined honestly for whatever useful information it contains, and then followed by a return to the underlying practice, rather than by its complete abandonment. This resilience is closely tied to aligning actions with long-term goals, since a clear, consistently held sense of what actually matters over an extended period provides a stable reference point that a single setback cannot easily undo. Without this reference point, a setback tends to be evaluated purely on its own terms, feeling disproportionately significant simply because nothing larger exists to place it in context. With a clear, ongoing connection to long-term goals, the same setback can be recognized as a temporary deviation from a much longer trajectory, disappointing but not decisive, one difficult event within a much larger and still ongoing process. Maintaining this alignment requires periodically revisiting long-term goals directly, rather than assuming they remain fixed in the background without any active attention. Goals that are never revisited tend to fade in influence over time, gradually losing their capacity to guide daily decisions as more immediate concerns and impulses take up increasing amounts of attention. Goals that are periodically and deliberately revisited retain more of their guiding influence, remaining available as a genuine reference point precisely during the moments, difficult decisions, setbacks, temptations, when that reference point matters most. Creating inner stability regardless of external circumstances represents one of the more advanced outcomes of everything discussed so far. Though it is worth understanding clearly, rather than treating as an abstract ideal, inner stability does not mean becoming unaffected by external events, immune to disappointment, loss, or difficulty. It means developing an internal foundation built through consistent practice of the capacities already discussed that does not depend entirely on favorable circumstances in order to remain intact. Most people, without this foundation, experience their internal state as largely determined by external conditions, feeling settled when things go well and destabilized when they do not. This arrangement leaves internal stability perpetually vulnerable to factors outside personal control, since circumstances, by their nature, fluctuate constantly and unpredictably. A person whose internal state rises and falls entirely with these fluctuations spends much of their life at the mercy of conditions they cannot reliably influence. Inner stability, developed through sustained practice of self-awareness, emotional regulation, and value-based decision-making, provides a different kind of foundation, one that remains more consistent even as external circumstances continue to shift. This does not mean external events stop mattering or stop producing genuine emotional response. It means that response no longer completely determines behavior or internal experience, since a stable internal foundation continues to provide a measure of steadiness even during periods when external circumstances are genuinely difficult. This foundation is built gradually through the same accumulated practice discussed throughout this exploration, not through a single decision to become more stable, but through repeated instances of noticing an emotional reaction, understanding it, and choosing a response deliberately across enough varied circumstances that this capacity eventually becomes reliable regardless of the specific situation triggering it. The lifelong nature of self-mastery deserves direct acknowledgement here, since it is easy to imagine this process as something eventually completed, a state reached after sufficient effort and then simply maintained without further attention. This expectation does not match how self-mastery actually functions in practice. The internal forces being managed throughout this exploration, impulse, emotion, distraction, fear, doubt, continue to arise for as long as a person remains alive and engaged with the world, regardless of how much progress has already been made in managing them. This means self-mastery is better understood as an ongoing practice than as a destination, similar in this respect to physical fitness, which requires continued maintenance rather than a single period of effort followed by permanent results. This does not diminish the value of progress already made. A person who has developed considerable self-mastery genuinely experiences life differently than someone who has not, with greater clarity, stability, and intentionality available across most situations. But this developed capacity requires continued practice to sustain, rather than becoming a fixed, permanent trait immune to any further attention or effort. How mastering yourself improves other areas of life becomes clearer once this underlying capacity is understood clearly. In leadership, self-mastery provides the composure and clarity that allow good judgment to remain accessible under pressure, rather than being overridden by reactive impulse during exactly the moments when clear judgment matters most. In relationships, it provides the emotional regulation and self-awareness that allow genuine connection and honest communication to continue even during conflict or disagreement, rather than being derailed by defensive or reactive behavior. In finances, it provides the capacity to delay gratification and make decisions based on long-term values rather than short-term impulse, a capacity that tends to matter more for long-term financial outcomes than any specific piece of financial knowledge. In communication, it provides the ability to listen fully and respond deliberately, rather than reactively, particularly during difficult or emotionally charged conversations. And in decision-making generally, it provides the internal clarity required to evaluate a situation accurately, rather than through the distorted lens of whichever emotion or impulse happens to be strongest in the moment a decision must be made. Each of these areas, distinct as they appear on the surface, draws on the same underlying foundation, a capacity to understand and direct one's own internal experience rather than being directed by it. This is why self-mastery tends to produce benefits that extend well beyond any single area of life, since the capacity being developed is not specific to leadership, relationships, finances, or communication individually, but underlies a person's overall relationship with their own mind, a relationship that shapes behavior across every context in which that mind is engaged. Most people wait for a significant challenge before attempting to practice any of this deliberately. A major decision, a serious setback, a moment of intense temptation. But these significant challenges are, in practice, the most difficult place to begin developing self-mastery, precisely because the intensity involved is high enough that old, automatic patterns tend to dominate before a newer, more deliberate capacity has had the chance to establish itself. The actual practice ground for self-mastery is found in the countless small moments that make up an ordinary day, a minor frustration, a small temptation to check a phone during focused work, a brief urge to postpone an easy but unappealing task. None of these moments carry significant consequences on their own, which is exactly what makes them useful. The stakes are low enough that practicing a pause, noticing an impulse before acting on it, carries very little risk if the attempt does not go perfectly. A person who practices this kind of awareness consistently in small, low-stakes moments is, without necessarily framing it this way, building the same capacity that will later be needed during a genuinely significant challenge. The underlying mechanism, noticing the gap between an internal state and an actual response, and choosing what happens in that gap, is the same regardless of the size of the situation. This is why people who appear remarkably composed and disciplined during major difficulties have usually built that capacity through years of smaller, far less visible practice, rather than discovering it suddenly the first time a genuinely difficult moment arrived. There is a trap worth naming clearly here, one that can develop once a person begins taking self-mastery seriously. A trap that looks like progress, but actually works against it. This is the tendency to respond to one's own lapses, a broken promise, an impulsive reaction, a moment of avoidance with harsh self-criticism. Treating each instance as evidence of some deeper inadequacy, rather than as ordinary information about where further practice is still needed. This harsh internal response tends to produce the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than motivating better behavior going forward, it tends to add an additional layer of discomfort on top of whatever the original lapse already produced. Discomfort that a person then becomes motivated to avoid, sometimes by avoiding the entire practice of self-examination altogether, since that examination has become associated with harsh internal judgment rather than with useful, neutral observation. A more effective internal response treats each lapse as information rather than as a verdict, noting what happened, what triggered it, and what might be done differently in a similar future moment, without attaching excessive judgment to the event itself. This is not the same as indifference or excusing behavior that genuinely warrants correction. It is a recognition that harsh self-judgment rarely produces lasting change, while honest, non-punitive observation tends to produce steadier, more sustainable improvement over time, because it does not create an incentive to avoid the very examination that improvement actually depends on. It is also worth distinguishing this kind of patient, non-punitive self-observation clearly from avoidance, since the two can look similar from the outside, while operating in almost opposite ways internally. Avoidance involves postponing a difficult internal reckoning specifically, because facing it feels uncomfortable, while that postponement gets framed, sometimes even to oneself, as patience or self-compassion. Genuine patience involves actively engaging with a difficult pattern, examining it honestly, while allowing enough time for gradual change to actually take hold. Avoidance involves the appearance of that same engagement, while very little honest examination is actually taking place, the delay serving primarily to postpone discomfort, rather than to allow genuine progress. The difference is not always obvious in a single moment, but it tends to become clear over time in whether a difficult pattern eventually shows genuine signs of change or continues indefinitely, protected by a version of patience that has, in practice, become a way of avoiding the discomfort of honest confrontation. Distinguishing between these two requires periodic, honest self-assessment, asking directly whether current practice is producing real, if gradual change, or whether it has quietly become a comfortable routine that avoids the more difficult work genuine change actually requires. It is useful, at this point, to bring together the different elements already discussed, not as separate techniques, but as a single, integrated moment that becomes more accessible with practice. The same moment that has been referenced throughout this exploration in different forms, the narrow space between an internal state and the behavior that follows it. An impulse, emotion, or moment of resistance arises first, automatically, often accompanied by a physical sensation, a tightening, a pull toward a specific action, a felt sense of urgency. Noticing this internal shift, rather than moving directly into a response, provides the earliest available point of awareness. Alongside this, an interpretation often forms quickly, a story about what the internal state means, whether it should be trusted, what it requires. Recognizing this interpretation as one possible reading, rather than as an automatic instruction, loosens its grip slightly, creating room for a broader, more considered evaluation. Within this space, values become accessible, a chance to weigh the immediate pull against what actually matters over a longer period, and to consider what response would genuinely serve the outcome being pursued, rather than simply relieving the discomfort of the present moment. From this widened vantage point, a response can be chosen deliberately, one that might still involve firm action, genuine feeling, or difficult effort, but that reflects considered judgment rather than automatic reaction. This entire process, in practice, often happens within a few seconds, particularly once it has been developed through repeated use. In earlier stages of building this capacity, the pause may need to be longer, deliberately extended, sometimes uncomfortably so, in order to allow this evaluation to actually occur rather than being overridden by the speed of the automatic response. With enough repetition, this space becomes available more quickly and more reliably, eventually requiring less conscious effort to access. There is another layer to this process worth examining: the role of environment and structure in supporting self-mastery. Since relying entirely on willpower and in the moment awareness tends to be an unreliable foundation over an extended period, willpower fluctuates considerably, weakened by fatigue, stress, and the simple accumulation of decisions already made earlier in a given day. A person depending entirely on willpower to resist every temptation and manage every impulse will find that capacity reliably available on some days and considerably diminished on others, producing an inconsistent pattern of behavior despite genuine, consistent intention. Environment and structure address this limitation by reducing how much a given behavior actually depends on willpower, being available in the moment it is required. An environment arranged so that a desired behavior requires minimal effort to initiate, and an undesired behavior requires more effort to access than it otherwise would, tends to produce more consistent results than an environment left entirely to chance, requiring willpower to overcome friction in both directions every single time. This is not a substitute for the internal work already discussed, the self-awareness, emotional regulation, and value-based decision, making that form the core of self-mastery. It is a complement to that work, reducing the frequency with which willpower must be relied upon directly, which in turn preserves that capacity for the situations where structural support is not available and genuine. In the moment discipline is required. There is a physical dimension to all of this that deserves direct attention, since the capacities being discussed, emotional regulation, patience, consistent follow-through, all draw on a finite reserve of physical and mental energy. This reserve is directly affected by sleep, physical activity, and basic attention to bodily well-being, factors that are sometimes treated as separate from the deeper, more psychological work of self-mastery. When in practice they form a genuine foundation that supports everything else discussed throughout this exploration. A person operating on insufficient rest tends to find every other capacity discussed here considerably harder to access, not because their understanding of these principles has weakened, but because the underlying capacity required to apply them has been depleted. Emotional regulation becomes less reliable when exhausted. Patience becomes harder to access when physically depleted. Even simple follow-through on minor commitments to oneself becomes more difficult when basic energy reserves are already strained. This suggests that attention to physical foundations is not separate from self-mastery, but a genuine part of it, protecting the underlying capacity that makes everything else discussed throughout this exploration actually possible to sustain consistently, rather than only during periods when circumstances happen to be favorable. None of this develops in a straight line, and it is worth stating clearly that setbacks in this practice should be expected rather than treated as evidence that the underlying effort has failed. There will be days and periods, even after considerable progress, where an old reactive pattern reasserts itself, where a decision is made according to mood rather than value, where a promise to oneself is broken despite genuine intention to keep it. This does not undo whatever progress has already been made. It is simply part of a longer, ongoing process, one that continues for as long as a person remains engaged with the practice at all. This non-linear reality matters because an inaccurate expectation of steady, uninterrupted progress tends to produce unnecessary discouragement when the inevitable interruption occurs, sometimes leading to a complete abandonment of an approach that was, in fact, producing genuine improvement overall. A more accurate expectation, one that anticipates occasional lapses as a normal feature of sustained internal change, tends to produce a more resilient response when these lapses occur, treating them as isolated deviations to be examined and corrected, rather than as evidence requiring a wholesale re-evaluation of the underlying effort. There is a deeper purpose beneath all of this that is worth naming directly. one connected to something larger than any single capacity already discussed. A form of autonomy that is easy to overlook precisely because it operates internally rather than externally. Most discussions of freedom and autonomy focus on external circumstances, the ability to make certain choices, to pursue certain paths without undue interference. This external autonomy matters, but it is not the only kind that shapes how a life actually unfolds. There is also an internal autonomy, the degree to which a person's actual behavior is determined by their own considered values and judgment rather than by whichever impulse, emotion, or old habitual pattern happens to be strongest in a given moment. A person can possess a great deal of external freedom, resources, opportunity, the absence of obvious constraint, and still find their actual behavior dictated, moment to moment, by internal forces that were never chosen deliberately, simply inherited from earlier patterns and never examined closely enough to be redirected. Self-mastery, understood this way, is not primarily about achieving better outcomes, though better outcomes often follow. It is about reclaiming the authorship of one's own behavior, ensuring that actions taken, particularly during difficult or emotionally charged moments, reflect considered judgment, rather than whichever automatic pattern happened to activate first. This authorship does not require eliminating impulse, emotion, or difficulty, which remain present throughout a person's entire life, regardless of how much internal work has been done. It requires ensuring that these internal forces no longer operate as the sole, unexamined authors of behavior, replaced instead by a more deliberate process that takes their information into account without being governed entirely by it. A common misunderstanding about self-mastery is worth addressing directly, because it tends to discourage people from pursuing this capacity in the first place. There is a tendency to associate self-mastery with a kind of emotional distance, imagining that a person who has developed strong internal discipline must, by necessity, be somewhat detached, unmoved, or lacking in warmth toward others. This association is not accurate, and in practice, the opposite tends to be closer to the truth. A person who is consumed by managing their own reactivity, their own anxiety, frustration, or impulsivity, has considerably less genuine attention available for others, since much of their internal capacity is occupied with their own unmanaged internal states. A person who has developed greater self-mastery, precisely because they are not consumed by this internal management, tends to have more available attention for genuine connection, more capacity to listen fully, to remain present during someone else's difficulty without being destabilized by it, and to respond to others thoughtfully rather than reactively. This capacity to remain present with another person's difficulty, without needing that difficulty to resolve immediately in order to feel comfortable, is often experienced by others as a particularly meaningful form of warmth and attentiveness, not as detachment. This clarifies what self-mastery is actually for. It is not a means of becoming less connected to others or less affected by life. It is a means of becoming more genuinely capable of connection, because the internal noise that would otherwise interfere with real presence, reactivity, defensiveness, distraction, has been substantially reduced. Honest, periodic self-review functions as a kind of feedback loop that quietly determines how effectively sustained effort towards self-mastery actually translates into genuine change over time. Effort alone does not guarantee progress, since it is entirely possible to apply significant effort towards self-improvement while repeating the same ineffective approach indefinitely. never adjusting because the ineffectiveness of that approach has never been honestly examined. This kind of honest review requires a degree of detachment from ego that can be genuinely difficult to maintain, particularly regarding effort a person has already invested considerable time and identity into. Acknowledging that a particular approach to self-improvement has not been working as well as hoped can feel, incorrectly, like a broader personal failure, which creates a strong incentive to avoid this kind of honest evaluation altogether. People who sustain genuine long-term growth tend to have developed a different relationship with this discomfort, treating honest self-review as a routine, expected part of the process, rather than as an occasional, threatening event to be avoided whenever possible. This same discipline extends to how comparison with others is managed throughout this process, comparing one's own current internal state, still developing, still imperfect, to an idealized image of what self-mastery is assumed to look like in someone further along, tends to produce discouragement without offering any genuinely useful information. A more accurate comparison examines one's own current position against one's own earlier position, asking whether meaningful internal change has occurred over a relevant period of time, a comparison that tends to reveal genuine progress even during periods when that progress does not yet match an idealized, and likely inaccurate, image of what complete self-mastery would actually look like. There is a trap worth naming clearly here, one that tends to affect people who have already made genuine progress in developing self-mastery. The trap of treating discipline as rigidity, an insistence on maintaining a particular routine or standard exactly as originally established, even when circumstances have changed enough that the original approach no longer serves its intended purpose. This rigidity can look like discipline from the outside, and it is easy to mistake for genuine self-mastery, but it tends to function quite differently underneath the surface. Genuine self-mastery retains a degree of flexibility that rigidity does not. It involves consistent commitment to underlying values and principles, while remaining willing to adjust the specific method through which those principles are applied, as circumstances genuinely require. A person committed to physical well-being, for instance, might need to adjust exactly what that commitment looks like during an unusually demanding period, without abandoning the underlying value itself. A person caught in rigidity tends to treat any deviation from the original method as a failure, sometimes abandoning the entire underlying commitment rather than adjusting the specific approach to fit a genuinely changed situation. This distinction matters because rigidity, despite superficially resembling discipline, tends to produce brittleness rather than durability. A rigid approach holds firmly until circumstances change enough that it becomes unsustainable, at which point it tends to break down entirely, often followed by complete abandonment of the underlying value, rather than a reasonable adjustment to the method being used to honor it. A genuinely disciplined approach, built around flexible application of a stable underlying value, tends to bend without breaking, adjusting its specific form as needed while preserving the consistency that actually produces meaningful long-term change. There is also a specific psychological weight worth understanding clearly, connected to how internal triggers often relate to something older than the present moment. A particular kind of comment, situation, or interaction might trigger a reaction disproportionate to what is actually happening, not because the current moment warrants that intensity, but because it resembles something from an earlier period, a pattern of experience that has left a lasting imprint on how certain situations are automatically interpreted. This does not mean every strong reaction has a hidden historical cause that must be uncovered before it can be managed. Many reactions are straightforward responses to a straightforward situation. But when a reaction feels disproportionately intense relative to what actually occurred, it is often worth asking, quietly and without judgment, whether this feeling is familiar, whether it resembles something experienced before in a different context. This kind of question does not require extensive analysis in the moment. It simply requires a brief pause to consider whether the current situation is being reacted to on its own terms, or whether it is being reacted to as an echo of something else, a distinction that, once recognized, often reduces the intensity of the reaction considerably. There is another practical dimension worth examining, the finite nature of decision-making capacity itself, which affects self-mastery in ways that are easy to overlook. Each decision, even a minor one, draws on a limited pool of mental resources, and this pool tends to deplete over the course of a day, regardless of how significant any individual decision happens to be. This means that self-control and considered decision-making tend to become somewhat less reliable later in a day, after many smaller decisions have already consumed a portion of this limited capacity. People who manage this well tend to reduce the number of minor decisions competing for this limited capacity, particularly around routine matters that do not benefit from fresh deliberation each time they arise. Establishing consistent routines around low-stakes, recurring choices, rather than deliberating freshly each time, preserves decision-making capacity for the moments that genuinely require careful, deliberate judgment. Whether that involves a difficult emotional situation, a significant decision, or a moment of genuine temptation that deserves full attention rather than whatever depleted capacity happens to remain by that point in the day. This same awareness affects how demanding internal work is scheduled. Significant emotional processing or difficult self-examination undertaken late in a demanding day after decision-making capacity has already been substantially depleted, tends to receive less careful, less patient attention than the same work would receive earlier when that capacity remains fresher. Recognizing this allows meaningful internal work to be deliberately scheduled for periods when genuine reflection is still accessible, rather than being addressed reactively whenever it happens to arise, often at the exact moments when the capacity for careful, non-reactive reflection has already been most depleted. There is also a simplicity worth preserving throughout this entire practice, since the principles discussed here can, if approached carelessly, become elaborated into an overly complicated system that becomes difficult to sustain in its own right. A practice built around consistent self-observation, honest self-review, and value-based decision-making works best when it remains reasonably simple, easy to return to after an interruption without requiring extensive reconstruction. An overly elaborate system, requiring significant effort simply to maintain its own structure, tends to introduce a new source of the exact kind of inconsistency it was originally designed to prevent. Since the system itself becomes one more thing that can be abandoned during a demanding period, this suggests that simplicity is not merely a stylistic preference, but a genuine functional requirement for sustainability. The most durable versions of the practices discussed throughout this exploration tend to be relatively simple, easy to describe in a single sentence, easy to resume without requiring elaborate reconstruction after a period of neglect. Complexity, however well-intentioned, tends to work against the very sustainability that these practices are meant to support. There is a particular difficulty worth naming directly, one that concerns the specific moment of beginning a difficult piece of internal work, distinct from the more general difficulty of sustaining that work once it has started. Most internal practices, once begun, become considerably easier to continue than they were to initiate, yet a disproportionate amount of resistance tends to concentrate specifically around that initial moment, before any momentum has had the chance to develop. This is why the specific difficulty of starting deserves attention separate from the more general question of discipline. A difficult self-examination avoided repeatedly is often not being avoided because the examination itself is unusually demanding, but because the specific moment of beginning carries a disproportionate psychological weight, an implicit acknowledgement being made, an uncertainty about what might be discovered, that continuing an already started process does not carry in the same way. People who consistently follow through on this kind of internal work tend to have developed, whether deliberately or through accumulated experience, specific habits that reduce the difficulty of this particular moment, often by deliberately lowering the bar for what counts as beginning, treating a very small, almost trivially easy initial action, noticing a single emotion, naming a single pattern as sufficient to begin, rather than waiting for the readiness to complete an entire process of self-examination before starting any part of it. Once started, even through this minimal initial action, the psychological resistance that made starting difficult tends to diminish considerably. There is a specific kind of patience required, especially in the earliest stages of developing self-mastery, since this period typically offers very little external confirmation that the effort is producing anything of value. Most environments provide relatively little feedback during this early stage, since meaningful internal change tends to accumulate slowly, well before it becomes visible enough, even to the person experiencing it, to be clearly recognized as progress. This is one of the more demanding aspects of this entire practice. Tolerating a prolonged period where the only available evidence that the approach is working comes from an internal, principle-based assessment rather than from any clear external confirmation. People who navigate this period most successfully tend to rely on the internal markers already discussed throughout this exploration: honest self-observation, adherence to established values, and a reasonably accurate understanding of how long genuine internal change typically takes, rather than waiting for a dramatic, confirming experience before continuing to invest genuine effort in the practice. There is a related tendency worth naming directly, one that tends to appear once meaningful progress in self-mastery has already been achieved, a gradual complacency that assumes the work, having produced genuine results, no longer requires the same level of ongoing attention. This assumption tends to be inaccurate. The internal forces being managed throughout this exploration do not become permanently subdued. Once a certain level of capability has been reached, they continue to arise, and the capacity to manage them well tends to require continued practice, in much the same way that other developed capabilities require ongoing maintenance rather than a single period of effort followed by permanent, effortless results. This suggests that genuine progress in self-mastery calls for a particular kind of humility, a continued willingness to examine one's own patterns, honestly even after considerable capability, has already been developed, rather than assuming that the work is essentially complete. This humility is not the same as self-doubt or a failure to recognize genuine progress already made. It is a clear-eyed recognition that the internal forces involved, impulse, emotion, distraction, doubt, remain a permanent feature of being a person engaged with a complex and often difficult world, regardless of how skillfully they have come to be managed. It is also worth addressing a misconception that sometimes accompanies discussions of self-mastery, the assumption that this entire process must be undertaken entirely alone, through private, internal effort disconnected from any external support or relationship. While the core work described throughout this exploration is genuinely internal, examining one's own patterns, regulating one's own emotional responses, aligning one's own decisions with considered values, this internal work is not necessarily undermined by seeking support, perspective, or honest feedback from others. In fact, other people often provide a kind of clarity that is difficult to access through internal reflection alone, particularly regarding patterns that have become so familiar they are no longer easily noticed from the inside. A trusted perspective from someone else can sometimes reveal a pattern of behavior or a recurring blind spot that months of internal reflection had not yet surfaced clearly. This does not diminish the fundamentally internal nature of self-mastery, since the actual work of regulating one's own thoughts, emotions, and decisions remains something only the individual person can ultimately do. But it suggests that this internal work benefits from being informed, periodically, by honest external perspective, rather than being pursued in complete isolation from any outside input at all. There is a cost worth naming directly to the alternative, a life where these internal forces remain largely unexamined and unmanaged. Since this cost tends to accumulate quietly in a way that is easy to underestimate from within any single moment, a person who has not developed self-mastery does not necessarily experience their life as chaotic or obviously troubled. Many people move through years, even decades, without developing much internal awareness or control, and the resulting pattern often looks, from the outside, like an ordinary life, simply less deliberate and less aligned with genuinely held values than it could otherwise have been. What tends to characterize this pattern, examined closely, is a persistent gap between what is genuinely wanted and what is actually chosen, moment to moment, a gap that produces a particular kind of quiet dissatisfaction, even when external circumstances are reasonably favorable. Decisions get made according to whichever impulse or mood happens to be strongest at the time, rather than according to any consistent underlying values, producing a life that, viewed in retrospect, can feel disconnected from what the person would have genuinely chosen if given the clarity to choose deliberately at each point along the way. This is the quiet cost of unexamined internal forces, not necessarily dramatic failure, but a gradual accumulation of decisions that reflect momentary impulse rather than considered intention, producing an outcome that, however outwardly reasonable, may bear only a loose resemblance to what would have emerged from a more deliberate, self-aware process. This cost is rarely visible in any single moment, which is part of why it remains so easy to overlook, but it becomes clearer when an entire life, or even a significant portion of one, is examined as a whole. This is also why self-mastery, despite requiring genuine and sustained effort, tends to be worth that effort regardless of any specific external outcome it eventually produces. even setting aside the practical benefits already discussed: greater discipline, stronger relationships, better decisions. There is a more fundamental value in simply living according to one's own considered judgment, rather than being governed by whichever internal force happens to be loudest in a given moment. This value is not easily quantified, but it tends to be recognized clearly by anyone who has experienced both states: a life largely reactive to internal impulse, and a life increasingly guided by deliberate, values-based intention. Bringing these different threads together: self-awareness, emotional regulation, delayed gratification, consistency, patience, resilience, values-based decision-making, a consistent picture begins to emerge, one that differs considerably from how self-mastery is sometimes portrayed. It is not a fixed state achieved once, and then simply maintained without further effort. It is not the elimination of impulse, emotion, or difficulty. And it is not primarily about outward discipline, visible achievement, or the appearance of control to others. At its core, self-mastery concerns something quieter and more internal: the ongoing relationship between a person and their own mind. A relationship built through sustained, honest attention, rather than through force applied against oneself. This relationship develops gradually, through countless small moments of noticing, understanding, and choosing, most of which will never be witnessed by anyone else and may never produce any single, dramatic, externally visible result. What it produces instead, over enough time, is something considerably more valuable than any single achievement. A person increasingly capable of acting in accordance with their own genuine values, even during moments of significant internal pressure, difficulty, or temptation. This capacity does not make life easier in any straightforward sense. Circumstances remain genuinely difficult at times. Emotions remain genuinely intense at times. What changes is the relationship between these difficult experiences and the behavior that follows them, a relationship built on understanding and deliberate choice, rather than automatic reaction. This is, in the end, what distinguishes a life, increasingly governed by intention, from one largely governed by whichever internal force happens to be present in a given moment. Not the absence of difficulty, but a different, more deliberate way of meeting it, built gradually, through sustained and honest attention to the one system that remains available for genuine improvement throughout an entire lifetime. The mind making the choices. Self-mastery is tested most directly in specific, recurring situations worth examining individually, since general principles become considerably more useful once applied to concrete circumstances. Interpersonal conflict represents one such situation, a moment where emotional intensity, ego, and immediate impulse all tend to converge at once, making the internal discipline discussed throughout this exploration considerably harder to access than it is during more solitary moments of reflection. During conflict, the pull toward defensive or reactive behavior tends to feel especially compelling, since disagreement is often experienced, at least initially, as a kind of threat to one's position, one's competence, or one's sense of being understood correctly. A person without developed self-mastery tends to respond to this felt threat immediately, defending, escalating, or withdrawing before any genuine evaluation of the actual situation has taken place. A person with developed self-mastery experiences the same initial pull, since conflict activates this response for nearly everyone, but tends to create enough space before acting on it to distinguish between a genuine issue worth addressing directly and a purely defensive reaction to the discomfort of being challenged. This same discipline applies, somewhat counterintuitively, to moments of success and achievement which carry their own particular risk to self-mastery, distinct from the risks posed by difficulty or failure. A significant success can produce a kind of overconfidence that narrows judgment in the opposite direction from fear or self-doubt, but narrows it nonetheless, tempting a person to relax the very habits and standards that produced the success in the first place, under the assumption that the achievement, once secured, will simply maintain itself without continued attention. A person who has developed genuine self-mastery tends to apply much the same discipline during success that they would apply during difficulty, continuing to examine decisions honestly, continuing to maintain established standards, rather than assuming that recent success guarantees the continued soundness of whatever comes next. This steadiness during success is, in its own way, just as significant a marker of developed self-mastery as steadiness during difficulty, even though it receives considerably less attention in most discussions of discipline and personal growth. There is a balance worth naming directly before this exploration draws toward its close, one that ties together much of what has already been discussed, the balance between genuine striving and genuine acceptance. Self-mastery, pursued without any acceptance of one's current limitations, tends to produce a harsh, perfectionistic relationship with oneself, one where any gap between current behavior and an idealized standard is experienced as failure rather than as an ordinary, expected feature of an ongoing process. Acceptance, pursued without any genuine striving, tends to produce the opposite problem, a passive resignation that stops examining or attempting to improve internal patterns at all, mistaking comfortable stagnation for a kind of peace that has not actually been earned through genuine internal work. Neither extreme reflects what self-mastery actually involves. Genuine self-mastery holds both simultaneously a real, sustained commitment to continued growth and improvement, alongside an honest acceptance of the current, imperfect state from which that growth necessarily begins. This balance is difficult to maintain precisely because it resists the simplicity of either extreme. It requires continuing to examine one's own patterns honestly, continuing to work toward greater alignment between values and behavior, while also accepting that this process is inherently gradual, imperfect, and never fully complete. This acceptance does not weaken the commitment to continued growth. If anything, it strengthens that commitment by removing the harsh, perfectionistic pressure that tends to make sustained effort considerably more difficult to maintain over the kind of extended period that genuine internal change actually requires. This balance also clarifies something important about how self-mastery should be recognized in daily life going forward, not through the absence of struggle, temptation, or difficult emotion, since these remain present regardless of how much progress has been made, but through the quality of the response that follows their arrival. A person who notices an impulse and chooses deliberately, even imperfectly, even after some initial hesitation, is practicing self-mastery in that moment, regardless of whether the final decision turns out, in retrospect, to have been the best possible one. The value lies less in achieving a perfect outcome every time, and more in the sustained practice of noticing, considering, and choosing deliberately, applied consistently enough, across enough ordinary moments, that it gradually becomes a genuine and reliable part of how a person moves through their life. Across an entire life, The accumulated effect of this sustained practice produces something considerably larger than any single moment of self-control could ever produce on its own. Each individual instance of noticing an impulse and choosing deliberately, however small, contributes to an accumulating pattern, one that gradually shapes not only outward behavior, but the underlying identity discussed earlier in this exploration, a person who increasingly experiences themselves as someone capable of aligning their actions with their genuine values, rather than someone repeatedly at the mercy of whichever internal force happens to be strongest at a given moment. This accumulated pattern tends to express itself in specific, observable ways over time, though these expressions are usually quiet enough to be easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention. A steadier response to provocation, a greater willingness to sit with discomfort rather than escaping it immediately, a more consistent alignment between stated intentions and actual behavior. None of these markers are dramatic on their own, and none of them would likely be noticed as evidence of anything significant if observed only once. Observed consistently, across enough time and enough varied situations, they become the clearest available evidence that genuine internal change has taken place, considerably more reliable evidence than any single dramatic moment of willpower or restraint could provide on its own. This is, in the end, what self-mastery actually looks like when examined honestly, not a finished state achieved once and displayed thereafter, but an ongoing, largely quiet practice, sustained across countless ordinary moments, most of which will never be witnessed by anyone else, gradually producing a person increasingly capable of meeting whatever arises, difficulty, temptation, uncertainty, doubt, with clarity and deliberate intention rather than automatic reaction. There is a final thread worth drawing out before this exploration comes to its close, one that connects everything already discussed to a simple but often overlooked observation about how life is actually experienced from the inside. Most people spend considerable energy trying to shape their external circumstances, believing, often without examining the assumption directly, that a better external situation would produce a better internal experience, more contentment, more confidence, more genuine satisfaction with how their life is unfolding. This assumption is not entirely wrong, since external circumstances do matter, but it tends to be significantly overstated, particularly once a reasonable baseline of external stability has already been established. Beyond that baseline, the actual quality of a person's internal experience tends to depend considerably more on how effectively they manage their own thoughts, emotions, and reactions than on further improvements to external circumstances, which is precisely why two people in similar external situations can report such different internal experiences of their own lives. This is not a claim that external circumstances are unimportant or that effort toward improving them should be abandoned. It is a recognition that internal governance, the capacity examined throughout this entire exploration, functions as a kind of multiplier on whatever external circumstances happen to exist, determining how effectively favorable circumstances are actually experienced and enjoyed, and how much resilience is available during circumstances that are genuinely difficult. A person with strong internal governance tends to experience both favorable and difficult circumstances with greater stability and clarity than a person without it, regardless of how those external circumstances compare to someone else's. This is why the invisible, internal work explored throughout this narration deserves a level of attention comparable to whatever external goals a person happens to be pursuing: career, relationships, financial stability, physical health, since the internal capacity to govern one's own thoughts, emotions, and reactions shapes how effectively progress is made toward each of these external goals, and how much genuine satisfaction is actually experienced once progress toward them has been achieved. A person who reaches significant external milestones without having developed corresponding internal governance often finds those milestones producing considerably less satisfaction than anticipated, since the internal experience of achievement depends as much on the internal state of the person achieving it as on the achievement itself. This suggests a final, practical implication worth carrying forward from everything discussed throughout this exploration. The work of self-mastery is rarely urgent in the way external demands often feel urgent, and it rarely produces the kind of immediate, visible confirmation that external achievements sometimes provide. This makes it easy to postpone indefinitely, treated as a lower priority than whatever external goal currently feels most pressing. But this internal work, sustained over time, tends to determine how effectively every other goal can actually be pursued, and how genuinely satisfying its eventual achievement will actually feel once reached. This is, perhaps, the clearest reason to take this internal work seriously, not as a separate, optional pursuit alongside more visible external goals, but as the foundation that determines how effectively those external goals can be pursued at all, and how much genuine value will actually be experienced once they are. Those who develop strong self-mastery over time tend to share a particular practice, though it takes different specific forms depending on the person: a regular, structured period of reflection, set apart from the busier stretches of daily life, during which internal patterns can be examined more closely than the pace of an ordinary day usually allows. This reflection does not need to be elaborate or lengthy. What matters is not its specific format, but its consistency, a recurring opportunity to notice patterns that might otherwise pass unexamined amid the ordinary demands of daily attention. This kind of regular reflection serves a function that occasional, unstructured self-examination tends not to provide as reliably: a consistent check against the natural tendency for internal patterns to drift unnoticed over time. Without this kind of recurring attention, gradual shifts in behavior, a slow erosion of a previously maintained standard, a quiet accumulation of avoided discomfort, tend to go unnoticed until they have become significant enough to produce a visible problem. With this kind of recurring attention, these same shifts tend to be noticed considerably earlier, while they remain small enough to be addressed without requiring the same degree of corrective effort a more established pattern would eventually demand. This reflection also provides a natural opportunity to revisit the underlying values and long-term goals discussed earlier in this exploration, ensuring that daily decisions remain genuinely connected to those values rather than gradually drifting toward whatever has felt most urgent or convenient in the time since they were last considered directly. Without this periodic reconnection, values tend to fade quietly into the background of daily life, still nominally held but decreasingly influential over actual behavior, replaced gradually by whatever immediate concerns happen to dominate a given stretch of time. There is one more distinction worth making before this exploration turns toward its close: the difference between effort sustained primarily to prove something to oneself or to others, and effort sustained through a genuine, internally held commitment to becoming more aligned with one's own considered values. The first tends to be a fragile foundation, dependent on continued external or internal validation that may not always be available, prone to collapsing once the specific thing being proven has either been proven or has stopped feeling urgent to prove. The second tends to be considerably more durable, since it does not depend on ongoing confirmation from any particular source, external or internal, but on a steady, quiet commitment that continues regardless of whether anyone, including the person themselves, happens to be actively noticing the progress being made. This distinction matters because self-mastery pursued primarily to prove something tends to produce a particularly brittle version of discipline, one that holds only as long as the underlying motivation to prove something remains active, and tends to falter once that motivation fades, or once the specific thing being proven has already been sufficiently demonstrated. Self-mastery pursued as a genuine, ongoing alignment with considered values tends to hold considerably more steadily, since its foundation does not depend on an external or internal audience, but on an internal commitment that remains just as relevant during unwitnessed, ordinary moments as it does during moments of visible challenge or achievement, bringing this exploration toward its natural conclusion. It is worth returning once more to the picture that has been building throughout, not a collection of separate techniques to be applied mechanically, but a single, underlying orientation toward one's own mind that shapes how every other aspect of behavior, thought, and decision-making eventually unfolds. Noticing an impulse before acting on it, examining a pattern honestly rather than defensively, choosing according to considered value rather than passing mood, none of these are truly separate skills. They are different expressions of the same underlying capacity, a willingness to create a small space between whatever arises internally and however one chooses to respond to it, and to use that space deliberately, repeatedly, across the countless ordinary moments that eventually shape an entire life. This capacity does not require a particular temperament or any inherent advantage that some people happen to have and others simply lack. It is built, gradually and imperfectly, through sustained, honest attention applied consistently over time, long before its effects become significant enough for anyone, including the person developing them, to fully notice. Everything explored across this narration, self-awareness and self-control, delayed gratification and patience, consistency and resilience, values held steady against the pull of passing mood, points toward the same quiet center, the narrow, recoverable space between an internal state and the response that follows it. A space available to anyone willing to keep noticing it, one ordinary moment at a time. Self-mastery is not perfection. It is not a state where impulse disappears, where emotion no longer arises, where difficulty stops presenting itself. No amount of sustained practice produces that kind of permanent, effortless calm, and expecting it tends to create exactly the kind of harsh, unforgiving relationship with oneself that works against genuine progress rather than supporting it. It is awareness, a clear, ongoing understanding of one's own patterns, triggers, and tendencies, developed through honest, non-judgmental observation rather than through wishful thinking about who one would prefer to be. It is discipline, not as a rigid set of rules imposed forcefully against oneself, but as a sustainable, consistent practice built through repeated, modest effort rather than through occasional, unsustainable intensity. It is the ability to act intentionally rather than automatically, to notice the narrow space between an internal state and the behavior that follows it, and to use that space deliberately, even imperfectly, rather than allowing it to pass by unnoticed as it does for most people, most of the time. Those who master themselves are not free from emotion. They still feel anger, fear, disappointment, excitement, sometimes intensely, in much the same way anyone else does. They are not free from temptation, still experiencing the pull toward immediate comfort or gratification that everyone experiences at various points throughout an ordinary day. They are not free from difficulty, still facing setbacks, uncertainty, and genuinely hard decisions in circumstances that offer no more clarity or ease than anyone else's circumstances typically do. They simply learn how to navigate these experiences with greater clarity and control, not through the elimination of these internal forces, which remain a permanent feature of being a person engaged with a complex and often demanding world, but through a developed capacity to notice these forces clearly, understand what they are signaling, and choose a response deliberately, informed by considered values, rather than governed automatically by whichever internal state happens to be strongest in a given moment. Over time, self-mastery creates confidence, resilience, stability, and freedom. Not because life becomes easier. Circumstances remain genuinely difficult at times, regardless of how much internal work has been done. Emotions remain genuinely intense at times, regardless of how much self-awareness has been developed. But because the individual becomes stronger, wiser, and more intentional, better equipped to meet whatever arises with clarity rather than automatic reaction, with considered judgment rather than impulsive response, with a stability that does not depend entirely on favorable external circumstances in order to remain intact. This confidence is not the confidence of someone who expects everything to go well. It is the confidence of someone who trusts their own capacity to meet whatever actually happens, difficulty or ease, setback or success, with clarity and deliberate intention, rather than being swept along by whichever internal force happens to arise first. This resilience is not the resilience of someone unaffected by hardship. It is the resilience of someone who has learned, through repeated practice, that a setback, however difficult, is a single event within a much longer process, not a final verdict on the entire effort. This stability is not the stability of someone whose circumstances never change. It is the stability of an internal foundation built gradually through sustained, honest attention that continues to provide a measure of steadiness even as external circumstances continue, as they always do, to shift. The next challenge you face may not require greater intelligence. It may not require greater resources, more favorable circumstances, or a different set of external conditions entirely. It may simply require greater mastery over yourself, a clearer understanding of your own patterns, a steadier relationship with your own emotions, a more consistent alignment between what you say you value and what you actually choose, moment to moment, when it matters most. Because the quality of your life is often shaped less by what happens around you, the circumstances, the people, the events largely outside your direct control, and more by how effectively you govern what happens within you, the thoughts, emotions, impulses, and decisions that remain, throughout your entire life, the one system consistently available for genuine and lasting improvement. This work is never fully finished, and it does not need to be, in order to be genuinely worthwhile. It continues quietly, across countless ordinary moments, most of them unremarkable, most of them unwitnessed, gradually shaping a person, increasingly capable of meeting their own life with clarity, intention, and a steadiness that does not depend on anything outside themselves in order to remain genuinely their own. That is enough, in the end. Not certainty that every future moment will be met perfectly, since it will not be. Simply enough reason to keep noticing the next impulse, the next emotion, the next narrow space between feeling and action, and to keep choosing, deliberately, one ordinary moment at a time, long before anyone else has reason to call it mastery at all. Not because the outcome is guaranteed. It never is, but because the alternative, drifting indefinitely at the mercy of whichever impulse happens to arrive first, was never really a life fully your own to begin with. So notice what arises next. Give it a moment before it becomes anything more. That moment, however small, is where all of this actually begins. It always has been. Quiet, ordinary, and entirely within reach, starting now.